What if your greatest strength, the very thing that makes you unique, also carries the power to isolate you, exhaust you, and even destroy you? Carl Jung believed he discovered exactly that. In his clinical practice, Jung began noticing a rare kind of person. These individuals weren't suffering from delusions, and they weren't imagining things. Instead, they seemed to see everything other people missed. They could read micro-expressions in an instant. They could sense hidden emotions before a word was spoken. They could detect lies with unnerving accuracy. And they felt the unconscious tensions that silently filled a room. Jung called this ability differentiated perception. And he considered it his most dangerous discovery. Why dangerous? Because the very gift of seeing clearly carried a cost few could endure. Again and again, Jung's patients who possessed this capacity ended up isolated, exhausted, and unable to maintain ordinary relationships. Not because they were unstable, but because they saw too much. The most striking case came to Jung in 1913, during his own psychological crisis after breaking with Freud. A highly introverted, intuitive patient arrived who possessed what Jung called indifferentiated intuitive perception. She would walk into a room and immediately sense its hidden atmosphere: who was lying, who carried resentment, who was silently in pain. When she described her impressions, Jung checked them carefully against reality. To his surprise, her observations were consistently accurate. Jung wrote of her, "The patient displays an extraordinary capacity for perceiving unconscious contents in others, but this faculty appears to cause her considerable distress rather than advantage. She couldn't make small talk, because she saw through every mask. She couldn't maintain friendships, because people felt exposed around her. She couldn't keep steady work, because her very presence disrupted the unspoken psychological agreements that hold groups together." Jung realized he wasn't looking at pathology. He was looking at what happens when human consciousness becomes too conscious, when perception becomes so advanced that it no longer fits social survival. In his notes, Jung observed how she spoke of others as if she had access to their private thoughts and hidden motivations. And when he investigated, her insights proved startlingly accurate. This wasn't psychosis. This wasn't fantasy. This was consciousness evolving beyond its collective container, and the result was dangerous. Because when you see clearly what others cannot, you are no longer living in the same world as everyone else. Jung was deeply unsettled by what he observed in that patient. If her ability wasn't madness, then what was it? How could someone see so clearly into the unconscious of others, and yet be crushed by the very clarity they possessed? To answer this, Jung began to investigate a phenomenon he called participation mystique. This term described a peculiar state where the boundaries between self and others blur. The individual doesn't just pick up surface-level signals, they absorb the entire psychological atmosphere of their surroundings. They feel the grief that hasn't been spoken. They sense the tension others deny. They embody emotions that don't even belong to them. Jung's insight would later be echoed by modern research. Psychologist Elaine Aron describes about 20% of the population as highly sensitive persons. These people process sensory and emotional information more deeply than average. But Jung went further. He identified something far more specific, and far more rare. Within his system of psychological types, he found that roughly 1% of people belonged to what he called the introverted intuitive type. Unlike general sensitivity, these individuals didn't just feel more, they perceived unconscious patterns with startling clarity. Jung called this differentiated intuition. Their minds didn't simply register obvious cues. They tracked unconscious emotional states, repressed contents, and hidden psychological structures that others couldn't see at all. They noticed the depression behind a forced smile. They sensed desperation beneath a confident speech. They felt the collective shadow a group silently agreed to ignore. But Jung didn't stop there. He discovered that even among these rare individuals, superior perception expressed itself in different forms. He outlined 4 distinct patterns of the introverted intuitive type. Type 1. The feeling intuitive. These individuals don't just see what others feel, they become it. They absorb emotions into their own body so completely that they can no longer tell which feelings are theirs and which belong to someone else. Jung described them as living in a state of perpetual emotional contagion. Type 2. The thinking intuitive. This type sees the hidden logic of unfolding events. They predict relationship breakdowns, career failures, or personal crises months before they happen, not by conscious reasoning, but through unconscious pattern recognition. Jung noted their uncanny ability to perceive the logical conclusions of unconscious processes. Type 3. The sensation intuitive. These individuals sense the physical manifestations of psychological states. They notice the tension in someone's shoulders before the person realizes they are stressed. They detect illness before symptoms are acknowledged. They feel the subtle bodily signals that betray deeper emotional realities. Jung saw them as early warning systems for both psychological and physical health. Type 4. The pure intuitive. The rarest, and often the most overwhelmed. This type perceives everything. Flooded with unconscious impressions, they receive vast amounts of information without the structure to process it. They live in a state of perpetual overwhelm, carrying truths they cannot easily organize or express. Jung believed that understanding which type you fall into matters enormously, because each one faces a different path to integration. So let me ask you, which of these 4 types sounds most like you? Do you tend to absorb emotions directly, like the feeling intuitive? Do you predict outcomes with eerie accuracy, like the thinking intuitive? Do you sense physical cues, like the sensation intuitive? Or do you feel constantly overwhelmed by everything you perceive, like the pure intuitive? Share your reflections in the comments. Because Jung believed that naming the pattern is the first step toward transforming it from a curse into a conscious gift. Jung believed that the real danger of superior perception wasn't in the perception itself. It was in what happens when that perception remains unintegrated. He saw it in case after case. The individuals who could see too clearly became mirrors that society could not bear to look into. Their very presence reflected back truths that others were desperate to avoid. And when you hold up a mirror to the unconscious, the response is rarely gratitude. More often, it's rejection, attack, even exile. The problem of the superior function. Jung called this the problem of the superior function. The very strength that sets you apart becomes the very thing that isolates you. Seeing what others cannot, you are cut off from the collective fabric that binds society together. Jung wrote, "The danger lies not in the perception itself, but in the psychic isolation it creates. When no one else sees what you see, you live in a reality that feels entirely your own." Shadow projection and the scapegoat. But the danger went further. Jung discovered that individuals with differentiated perception often became targets of what he called shadow projection. Here's how it works. When you perceive the unconscious contents of another person, you reflect back to them the very qualities they have refused to acknowledge in themselves. The unconscious then has 2 choices: either integrate what is being revealed, or attack the one revealing it. Time and again, Jung's patients described this same pattern. They would gently suggest that someone seemed troubled, only to be accused of being negative. They would voice concern about obvious problems, only to be blamed for creating drama. The one who sees clearly gets treated as the problem. They become the scapegoat, not because they cause conflict, but because they reveal it. Jung captured it in one chilling observation. The bearer of superior perception becomes the repository for all that the group cannot consciously acknowledge about itself. This is why so many perceptive individuals report feeling systematically targeted, not by coincidence, but as a direct psychological defense mechanism of the collective. The 3 dangers. Jung identified 3 specific dangers that make unintegrated superior perception so threatening. 1. Collective disruption. Seeing through shared illusions destabilizes groups. Every family, every workplace, every society has silent agreements about what will and will not be acknowledged. Break those agreements simply by existing authentically, and you threaten the fragile cohesion that keeps groups together. 2. Psychological isolation. Jung called this the curse of consciousness. What you see cannot be easily shared with those who do not possess the same perception. The result is both social and existential, feeling like you inhabit a different reality from everyone around you. 3. Identity dissolution. Most dangerously, the perceptive individual risks losing themselves entirely. Absorbing the unconscious contents of others, they become flooded with psychological material that is not their own. Boundaries dissolve. Jung called this participation mystique, the merging of self into collective possession. And he warned it could lead to nothing less than psychological annihilation, the complete loss of an authentic individual identity. Jung was blunt about the stakes. To see too much without learning integration was to risk both exile and collapse. And yet, he did not believe this condition was hopeless. Quite the opposite, because for Jung, the very dangers of superior perception were also the doorway into its transformation. And so he developed a process, a path to integration, a path that could turn the curse into a gift. Jung believed that if superior perception was left unintegrated, it could isolate, overwhelm, and even annihilate the individual. But he also believed there was a path, a way to transform the very thing that threatened to destroy you into the very thing that could heal both yourself and others. He called this path individuation. Individuation was Jung's central psychological process, the journey of becoming whole, of integrating unconscious contents while preserving a strong, authentic sense of self. And for those with differentiated perception, it was not optional. It was urgent. Jung developed a three-phase approach that allowed perceptive individuals to protect their identity, reclaim their boundaries, and transform their gift into wisdom. Phase 1. Recognition and differentiation. The first task, Jung taught, is learning to recognize when you are absorbing psychological material that isn't your own. He called this conscious discrimination, the ability to ask, does this belong to me, or to someone else? Without this step, the individual is doomed to confusion, lost in a sea of feelings and impressions that never truly originated within them. To strengthen this ability, Jung instructed patients to spend daily time in solitude. In silence, the absorbed material could settle. Slowly, the authentic voice of the self could be distinguished from the noise of everyone else's unconscious. Phase 2. Shadow integration. But recognition alone wasn't enough. Jung discovered that those who see others' shadows most clearly are often those who have not yet integrated their own. The more you deny your own selfishness, cruelty, or deception, the more intolerable it becomes to see those qualities in others. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." Shadow integration means acknowledging that every human quality you observe in others lives within you as well. This doesn't make you bad, it makes you whole, and paradoxically, the more you integrate your own shadow, the less harshly you perceive it in others. You begin to see with clarity, but without judgment. Phase 3. Conscious participation. Finally, Jung taught that the most advanced task was to engage with others' unconscious contents without being overwhelmed or consumed by them. He called this conscious participation. It required developing what he named psychological containers, the ability to temporarily hold another person's emotions, projections, or shadow, while never confusing it with your own. Think of it like carrying a glass of water for someone. You hold it carefully, but you know it's not yours to drink. In this way, the perceptive individual becomes a bridge between the conscious and the unconscious. They help others face truths they would otherwise avoid, while maintaining their own psychological integrity. For Jung, individuation was more than therapy. It was a survival manual for those gifted and burdened with superior perception. Jung didn't just see the dangers of superior perception in his patients. He saw it written in history, in the lives of brilliant figures who either integrated their perception or were destroyed by it. And in his own life, he faced this struggle directly. Nietzsche. The collapse of unintegrated perception. Take Friedrich Nietzsche. Jung admired Nietzsche's extraordinary insight into human nature, the way he could pierce through social, religious, and philosophical facades with devastating clarity. But Jung also believed Nietzsche never learned to integrate what he saw. Instead of using his perception to build bridges of understanding, Nietzsche wielded it like a weapon. He attacked society with it, and in doing so, cut himself off from others. Jung observed, Nietzsche possessed extraordinary insight, but he remained identified with his superior function, rather than integrating it into a balanced personality. In the end, Nietzsche's isolation and eventual breakdown became a tragic example of what happens when superior perception consumes the individual rather than transforms them. Meister Eckhart. Successful integration. In contrast, Jung pointed to the medieval mystic Meister Eckhart as a model of successful integration. Eckhart possessed what Jung called mystical intuition, the ability to perceive spiritual and psychological realities beyond ordinary comprehension. But unlike Nietzsche, Eckhart did not identify with this ability or wield it as superiority. Instead, he spoke with humility, channeling his insights into compassion and service. Jung wrote, Eckhart transformed his superior perception into wisdom that nourished others. He saw clearly, but spoke in ways that invited understanding rather than resistance. For Jung, Eckhart represented what happens when perception is integrated. It becomes not a weapon, but a medicine. Jung's own confrontation with the unconscious. But perhaps the most striking example was Jung himself. Between 1913 and 1919, following his break with Freud, Jung entered what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. During this time, he was flooded with visions, dreams, and overwhelming perceptions that nearly drove him into psychosis. He later recorded these experiences in the Red Book, writing, I was menaced by a psychosis and was saved only by my ability to understand what was happening to me through my work with patients. His superior perception nearly destroyed him, until he reframed it. Jung realized that what he was experiencing wasn't pathological. It was evolutionary. Consciousness itself was attempting to grow beyond the limitations of the collective. This realization transformed not only his own life, but his entire approach to psychology. He came to see those with differentiated perception not as broken, but as pioneers, individuals carrying the seeds of humanity's future consciousness. So here we see both sides of Jung's discovery. In Nietzsche, perception led to collapse. In Eckhart, it became wisdom. And in Jung himself, it became the foundation of a new psychology. The lesson was clear. Seeing too much is not what destroys you. Failing to integrate what you see is what destroys you. For those who learned it, perception became not a curse, but a path to transformation. Jung understood that for those with superior perception, isolation was one of the greatest dangers. To see so much is to risk living in a reality no one else seems to share. But Jung also knew that the right relationships could transform this isolation into strength. He wrote of the importance of finding the few who understand, people capable of engaging with differentiated consciousness without fear, defensiveness, or rejection. The three types of supportive relationships. Jung identified three kinds of relationships that could nurture, rather than destroy, the perceptive individual. 1. Fellow individuated persons. These are people who have themselves gone through the process of individuation. Jung noted that they recognize one another instantly, a kind of authenticity that cannot be faked. With them, the perceptive person can finally be fully authentic, without fear of overwhelming or threatening anyone. 2. Those actively engaged in individuation. Even if someone has not yet fully individuated, Jung observed that anyone sincerely engaged in their own inner work, through therapy, spiritual practice, or honest self-reflection, can usually bear to be known by others. They may not share the gift, but they value it. 3. Natural containers. Finally, Jung described a rare type of individual who may not possess differentiated perception themselves, but who carry a natural psychological strength. They can hold the emotions, projections, and contradictions of others without being destabilized. Often these are people who have endured significant life challenges and emerged with maturity and depth. Recognizing safe relationships. But how do you know who is safe? Jung developed certain indicators. They ask genuine questions about your observations, instead of immediately becoming defensive. They can acknowledge their own contradictions and limitations without collapsing into shame. They maintain emotional stability when confronted with uncomfortable truths. They show genuine curiosity about inner reality and growth. These signs reveal that the person can engage with perception without feeling threatened by it. The gradual revelation protocol. Jung also warned against revealing too much, too quickly. Instead, he advised what we might call a gradual revelation protocol. 1. Begin with small, gentle observations. 2. Watch carefully how the other person responds. 3. Notice whether they grow defensive or curious. 4. If they remain open, gradually increase depth. 5. Always frame insights as offerings, never as pronouncements. In this way, perception becomes a gift, not a weapon. And connection becomes possible without overwhelming the other person. Jung emphasized that supportive relationships are not just desirable, they are essential. Because no matter how strong, no perceptive individual can thrive in total isolation. The privilege of a lifetime, Jung wrote, is to become who you truly are. But this cannot be realized in isolation. It requires witnessing by those capable of recognizing authenticity. For Jung, the integration of superior perception was never just about surviving isolation. It was about serving something far greater. He believed that individuals with differentiated perception played a vital role in human evolution. They were not accidents. They were pioneers, consciousness scouts, appearing ahead of their time to sense what the collective could not yet bear to see. Serving evolution. Jung saw these individuals as culture carriers, people whose integration of perception allows them to bring hidden truths into collective awareness. They sense patterns of collective behavior before others do. They feel the shadow of society before it erupts. They see possibilities for meaning, spirituality, and growth beyond the limits of current frameworks. In this sense, their burden carries a purpose: to help prepare humanity for necessary steps in its development. Jung wrote, "The individual has always been the carrier of the living spirit, the one who brings about the change in society." The 4 stages of transformation. But how does perception evolve from burden into service? Jung outlined 4 stages. 1. Recognition without overwhelm. The first transformation is simply acknowledging your perception without being crushed by it. Jung called this conscious acceptance of the superior function. To say, yes, I see differently, and that is real. 2. Integration without isolation. Next comes learning to use perception constructively while staying connected to others. Jung called this social individuation. Remaining authentic without withdrawing into superiority or exile. 3. Service without sacrifice. At this stage, perception becomes a gift rather than a curse. The individual offers their insights in service to others, without depleting themselves or turning into a martyr. 4. Legacy without attachment. Finally, perception matures into what Jung called the transcendent function. The individuated person contributes to the evolution of collective consciousness, not for personal recognition, but simply because it is their role in the unfolding of human development. Service without martyrdom. Jung was careful to draw a line here. He warned that the point was not to suffer endlessly for the sake of others, nor to see oneself as a savior. The goal was to become a bridge between what is and what is becoming. To bring unconscious truths into awareness, without losing oneself in the process. As Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, and then to offer that authentic self in service of the whole." In Jung's vision, the highly perceptive individual is not cursed to be an outcast forever. They are meant to become a living channel through which consciousness itself can evolve. Their vision is not just for them, it is cultural medicine. Jung was clear. The path of integration is not a one-time achievement. It is a lifelong process. And he warned that there are specific pitfalls that can derail even those who have begun to transform their perception into a gift. Pitfall 1. The inflation trap. When perception becomes identified with the ego, the individual falls into what Jung called psychological inflation. The person begins to believe they are a prophet, a savior, or the sole bearer of truth. Instead of integrating their superior function, they become possessed by it. Jung wrote, "The danger is that the ego identifies with the archetype, leading to an inflation that cuts the individual off from human relationships. What begins as insight turns into superiority, and what could have been wisdom becomes isolation." Pitfall 2. The withdrawal justification. Others respond to the burden of perception by withdrawing completely. They decide that people are too unconscious to be worth engaging. Jung warned that this, too, is a form of defeat. To retreat into spiritual superiority, to cut off from life, is not individuation. It is collapse in disguise. He wrote, "True individuation requires engagement with the unconscious world, not escape from it. The hermit who withdraws from life has not transcended it, but has been defeated by it." Pitfall 3. The helper's trap. Some perceptive individuals become addicted to being needed. They define their entire identity around helping others, seeing for others, carrying the burdens of others. But Jung warned that when perception becomes identity, the person disappears behind the role. This is not individuation, it is self-sacrifice masquerading as purpose. Pitfall 4. The overwhelm return. Even those who integrate successfully can regress. During times of stress, trauma, or major life transitions, boundaries collapse again. Flooded with unconscious material, they feel as though they are back where they started. Jung emphasized that integration is not permanent. It is dynamic, a conscious dance that must be maintained. Practices for ongoing integration. So what sustains healthy integration? Jung recommended several lifelong practices. Regular solitude, to clear absorbed material and return to your own inner voice. Conscious choice, deciding when, where, and with whom to use perceptive abilities. Ongoing shadow work, to prevent projecting your own unconscious contents onto others. Supportive connections, relationships that provide reality checks and safe containers. Creative expression, as an outlet for overwhelming perception and a way to give form to unconscious material. Jung reminded his patients that the goal is not perfection. The goal is to remain conscious. He wrote, "The integrated person does not achieve perfection, but learns to dance consciously with their own psychological complexity." Jung's most dangerous discovery was not that some people see more than others. It was that most people who see everything never learn to use what they see wisely. The danger lies not in the perception itself, but in failing to develop a conscious relationship with extraordinary abilities. A gift, not a malfunction. Jung wanted his patients to understand. Their superior perception was not a flaw. It was not a psychological malfunction. It was an advanced feature of consciousness, the sign of a psyche evolving ahead of its time. So if you've been told you're too sensitive, too intense, too much, Jung would say, you are not broken. You are simply ahead, transformation, not destruction. The question is not whether you should suppress what you see to fit in. The question is whether you will develop the skills of individuation, the recognition, the shadow work, the conscious participation, that can turn isolation into connection, and overwhelm into wisdom. Because when you integrate, perception stops being a psychological curse. It becomes an evolutionary contribution. The world needs your insight. Make no mistake, the world needs people who can see what others miss. It needs those who sense the hidden patterns, the shadows beneath the surface, the truths that collective consciousness tries to deny. But it doesn't just need your perception. It needs your wisdom, your humility, your ability to deliver truth as medicine, not as a weapon. That's how perception becomes not only bearable, but transformative. Consciousness pioneers. Jung believed that perceptive individuals are meant to be consciousness pioneers. They appear before society is ready, carrying insights that feel dangerous now, but necessary for the future. What is not brought to consciousness, Jung wrote, comes to us as fate. Your role is not to save everyone. It is to live consciously enough that what you see becomes part of the collective before it erupts destructively. The true danger. So the true danger is not that you see too much. The true danger is never learning to see with integration, with balance, with wisdom. Because if you do, you stop being crushed by your perception, and instead become exactly what Jung believed humanity most needs: a bridge between the unconscious and the conscious, a pioneer of what is yet to come. So if you recognize yourself in Jung's description, remember this: you are not too much for this world. You are precisely what consciousness evolution requires. The question is, will you allow your gift to isolate you, or will you learn to wield it wisely, as cultural medicine for a society in desperate need of deeper seeing? If this resonated with you, share in the comments which type of perceiver you feel you are. Because part of individuation is realizing you are not alone, there are others walking this same path. And if you'd like to explore more of Jung's insights into the hidden dangers and hidden gifts of the psyche, make sure to subscribe. Because this is only the beginning of what Jung believed was the most urgent work of our time: the evolution of consciousness itself.